Okay, so now I'd like to go over the translate tools here on the left and also describe the channel box editor and the attribute editor. Um, like I said, everything in Maya is, you can manipulate objects in Maya by using these translate tools. I'm going to hit F on my keyboard to frame up this sphere that I just created. And I can manipulate whole objects using the translate tools, and I can manipulate components of objects using the translate tools. And that is kind of basically how you would model in Maya, is by using the translate tools to either select a piece or a component of your objects, or the entire objects, or multiple objects, and then using the translate tools of move, rotate, and scale. So I'm going to click right here, the move tool, or I can also hit W on my keyboard, and you'll see that we have this pivot that appears in the workspace at the center point of this object. And this pivot has these arrows that correlate to the axes directions that you see down here. And by pulling on these arrows, I'm able to move this object in, if I hit the green arrow, I'm able to move it in the Y direction. If I hit the red arrow, I can pull this just in the X direction. And again, the blue is the Z direction. We also have these little squares, and so that allows you to move them within a kind of plane perpendicular to the axes that is represented in the color of the square. So if I hit this blue axis here, I'm moving it in the plane of the X and the Z axes only. You can see this maybe a little bit easier over here, that I'm not able to move it at all in the Z direction. And this can be kind of helpful if, let's say, we have this like placed here on the floor of the grid, right on the base of the grid, and I want to move it along that base. I can hit this little green square here and move it just in those directions. So I'm not moving it at all in the Y direction. I can do the same thing here using the same type of pivot. Now I have it, I clicked my rotate tool here. Now I'm able to rotate this object, and it works under the same principles. You can click any of the colored lines here in order to rotate in the different axes, around the different axes. So here I'm rotating around the y-axis, here I'm rotating around the z-axis, and here I'm rotating around the x-axis. If I hit this this outer kind of sphere here, I'm able to rotate it in whatever direction I'm looking at, the whatever plane, or kind of I'm looking at this object from a certain perspective, and I'm able to rotate kind of around whatever that perspective is. If you can kind of get a sense of how this is rotating. So it's a little bit more of a free kind of rotation. And now you can see, now that I rotated this object, you can see that the axes here have changed for the rotation. They've changed to be along the object axes, and it's no longer in a kind of world space. If I go back to my move tool, however, you'll see that those axes are still preserved in a kind of world space. So I want to talk a little bit about that quickly. If I double click on my tools, or again, I can bring up my tool settings here, I'll get this floating box. I'm actually going to embed this floating box next to the outliner because I think that's kind of helpful. I can, if I double click here on my tool settings for the move tool, I have what's called the axis orientation here. And so right now it's set to the world space. And so I will always be, if I'm in world, if my axis is oriented to the world, I am able to manipulate this object according to these kind of strict world space coordinates that you see down here. But if I can change this now to, let's say, object mode, and it shifts the position of that pivot to correlate to the axes of this object. And so because I had rotated this object, Now the Y direction, the top of it is kind of pointed up in this direction. And so if I have my axis orientation on object, I'm able to manipulate this, move this object around this world space based on its own axes and own kind of coordinates here. And so this can be really helpful for moving objects to a particular location, whether it be in object mode or back to world space. This is being reset to correlate to the kind of global axis system that we have here in the X, Y, and Z direction. And then again, we have we can rotate. So we've rotated this object, and now it's in the object axis orientation mode, but I can switch that back to world space too. So if I have this object kind of on this tilt, and I still can manipulate it from a kind of standard global axis orientation here. And the same thing for scale, which again is the R key on your keyboard. Scale tool works like rotate and move, in that it correlates to axes. And so I'm able to manipulate the size of this object by pulling on these different tabs that correlate to axes. So again, here I'm in the object mode of the axis orientation, and so I can adjust the size of this object by pulling in the Y direction, in the Z direction, in the X direction, or I can hit this center cube and uniformly scale this object up or down. And again, if I go back to my world orientation, now I can manipulate this object within the kind of coordinates of the kind of global space here. So these are some of the ways that we can start to model or manipulate what are these primitive polygonal shapes up here in order to customize and create the kind of 3D scene and environment and models and objects that we are trying to create. Another good tool to be aware of when working with the translate tools is something called soft selection down here. So if I open up this soft selection tab under my tool settings, and right now I'm in the scale, I'm in my scale tool. Soft selection allows you to select components of an object or multiple objects based on a kind of gradient. And I guess the best way to kind of describe this would be maybe to, I'm going to delete this just by hitting the delete key. And I'm going to create a couple different, I'm going to hit W on my keyboard to move this. I'm going to create a couple different spheres here to give you an indication of how that soft selection might work. Okay, so, and I'm able to select multiple objects in my scene by hitting the Shift key and selecting multiple objects, or I can kind of create a marquee, drag around the objects, or in my outliner, I'm able to select specific objects from my outliner. Okay, so if I have selected here, I think I need to select just a single object here. And if I go down to, let's say I'm going to be in my move tool, okay, I'm going to try soft selection for move, and I hit the soft selection on. There's a couple different fall off modes. I can get into soft selection a little bit more when we start to talk about manipulating components, but we're just going to be looking at manipulating objects currently, just momentarily. We'll get into the other stuff later. I have here what's called the fall off mode, and so if I change that to, let's say, global, now you can see that this object, there's kind of like an invisible gradient that that exists around this object that allows me to kind of manipulate other objects around based on this object, based on the manipulation of this object. So the best way to do it is just for you to see it. I'm here and I'm kind of pulling and moving this object, and you can see because it's influencing this object next to it, it's starting to manipulate the object next to it. I'm going to hit undo by hitting Command Z on my keyboard. If I change that fall off mode to object, now it's going to, that gradient here shifted. So now it's kind of uniformly um, maybe going to influence this object next to it by, let's say, maybe 30% or so, right? And you can see here, here's the kind of fall off color that's represented by this fall off curve. If I move this, it's going to move that other object kind of um, at a certain kind of percentage of movement that this one is. I can change that kind of fall off radius here, basically how large that kind of, let's say, a force field or something of this kind of soft selection that's around this object by, I can increase it. And now if I increase it, you can see that it's going to be influencing the two objects next to it. And so now I'm able to move these objects at a certain kind of percentage or rate of movement that the initial object is being moved. The same thing, let's say, with scale. So I still have under my tool settings, I have this soft selection on and a similar fall off radius, and now I can kind of scale these things at a same kind of interval or percentage of what I'm scaling the original at. And so this is kind of an interesting way that you can start to manipulate objects relative to each other, but also it's kind of it's useful when you're manipulating certain components within objects as well. And again, if I have something like global on, let me increase this radius a little bit more, and now if I scale this, it's not going to be addressing the whole object. It's starting to address just certain components of this object, and you can see this visualized by this kind of difference in color that's on the object itself. Okay, so next I want to talk about this channel box layer editor here, this tab. And this channel box is a list of all of the very specific numerical values of the different transform tools. So translate in all the different axes, directions, rotate, and scale. So I just created this object. It's at the origin of our viewport here, of our grid. So it has a 0 translate in all directions. And it also has a 0 rotate in all directions. And its scale is set to 1. So it's 1, the radius of this sphere is 1 unit, is equal to 1 unit in all directions. So if I, let's say now, manipulate this, I can do this, I can, I can kind of work intuitively in the viewport here by using my translate tools, my transform tools, in order to adjust kind of the placement or the scale or the rotation of objects. But I can also manipulate things really, really precisely here in the channel box. So I've moved, it tells me an exact numerical value based on the working units of that are in our settings. It's translating, it's showing me like how I've translated this object in relationship to its kind of global center or the origin here. And so I can go ahead and enter in a numerical value here. And let's say I want to translate actually I want this sphere to sit exactly on the base of the grid. So I can try my best to kind of adjust this in my perspective view. I can also hit my space bar and maybe be working from a front view here. Let me press F to frame this up, and I can try my best to kind of get the bottom of this sphere right exactly on this, right exactly on the kind of sitting on the base of the grid. But you can see here in the channel box editor that it's not exactly exactly sitting flat on the grid. And, I can kind of do a little bit of math here and say, okay, if the radius of this sphere is 1, then the entire height of the sphere is 2. And if the pivot is at the center point of the sphere, then if I move this up in the translate y direction by 1 unit, it will be sitting perfectly flat on the grid. So I can go back to here and I can just hit number 1, and it's going to be sitting now perfectly flat on the grid, um, exactly at that origin point, the bottom of the sphere. So this is really important. That's something that's going to be important if you're going to be, let's say, 3D printing something, because you need your 3D print to begin printing flat on a kind of real bed of the 3D printer. And so you need you need your object to be sitting flat, completely flat on the kind of grid space here in order for your 3D print to work properly. But we'll get into that a little bit later. What you can know here about the channel box is that this is where you can kind of uniformly, and I can select multiple things at once, this is where you can kind of really precisely dial in on a particular scale, rotate, or translate numerical value in order to work really precisely. So let's say I want to increase this. I can say, come over to my, excuse me, I can come over to my viewport here and say, okay, I think I'm going to scale this up by 2, but I won't really know. I want to double the size of this, and I can try to kind of get it as accurate as I can by eyeballing it, but if I use my channel box editor, I can very precisely just increase its value by 2. And I can change all of these values by selecting all of them and changing it all at once. I can translate or rotate something. If I want to rotate this at 45 degrees in all directions, I can highlight all of these here by hitting the Shift key and typing in 45, and now it'll rotate this object in 45 degrees in all directions. Another thing about the channel box is we have the ability to turn on or off the visibility of this object in the scene by switching between, and right now I'm just kind of scrolling between these two, hitting left mouse button and just scrolling between on and off. And so I'm able to now see the object. It either is appearing or disappearing in the workspace. But I can see in my outliner, this object still exists. And now it's grayed out. And so it's just like these cameras that are standard and default kind of working view cameras, they're not visible in the scene, but they are there. And so I've just done the same thing here with my sphere. And I can do the same thing by hitting 1 for on or 0 for off in a kind of binary function as well.